He had to create conditions in which one nation could blame the other for the debacle that engulfed its troops, to sow mutual distrust, to deal such a blow that the people of Britain, Canada, and America would demand that their leaders bring their boys home. Surely, at some point, the Western democracies would realize that it was Adolf Hitler who had long been fighting their battle for them, the battle to keep the pagan communist hordes out of civilized Europe. Hardly had Hitler dismissed the four commanders on December 2nd than he ordered preparations to begin for a move from the Wolfschanze to underground concrete chambers amid the wooded Taunus hills, little more than a mile and a half up a winding road from Ziegenberg Castle. From there, the Adlerhorst he personally would direct his grand offensive, as he had done from the same place for his triumph in 1940. Under a design little altered from the one he had had in mind that day in September, when he had slapped the map on his desk and first announced his decision, here out of the Ardennes, with the objective, Antwerp. Adolf Hitler and his intelligence chiefs considered that they had the most secure enciphering system for wireless communications in the world. It was impossible, they were convinced, to break its codes. It consisted of a machine that looked like a bulky portable typewriter in a varnished wooden case measuring 7 by 11 by 13 inches. The letters on the keyboard were arranged like those on a typewriter, but there the similarity ended. There were no numbers or punctuation marks, and on a deck behind the keyboard, the 26 letters of the alphabet appeared in alphabetical order in 3 rows. When an operator punched a letter on the keyboard, one of the letters on the deck lit up, but never the letter the operator punched, and if the operator punched the same letter another time, yet another different letter lit up. As the operator worked, an assistant wrote down the letters as they appeared on the deck, and what he put down looked to be merely a jumbled collection of meaningless letters. The assistant then transmitted the jumble of letters in Morse code by wireless. Equipped with the same type of machine, the operator for whom the message was intended typed the jumbled letters onto his keyboard, whereupon they appeared on the deck in the same order in which the original operator had typed them and spelled out a meaningful message. Like almost any transmission by wireless, the jumbled message could be intercepted. Yet it could be decoded in theory only by someone equipped with the same type of machine, and even then the decoder would have to know what particular setting the sender had used on his machine that day, for there were literally millions of possible settings. By late 1944, the Germans were changing the settings at least once a day, and there were different settings each day for each of the services that used the machine: the Army, the Navy Luftwaffe, SS Gestapo, and such civilian services as the Reichsbahn. The machine was known as the Enigma, named after the Enigma variations in which the British composer Sir Edward Elgar described his friends in musical cipher. A Dutchman invented and patented it in 1919, but when he was unable to build a marketable machine, he sold the patents to a German engineer and inventor, Arthur Scherbius. As successfully designed and developed by Scherbius, the machine was intended for commercial use to protect business secrets. By the time Hitler came to power in the early 1930s, the Enigma had been vastly improved. The reforming and expanding Wehrmacht adopted the machine as its basic enciphering device, and continued to increase its capabilities and complexity while retaining its compactness and portability, which made it ideal for use in the field. As Hitler began his preparations for Wacht am Rhein, it was apparent that somehow the Western Allies were obtaining German secrets, but so convinced was Hitler of the security of the Enigma, and as a dictator, so obsessed about traitors, that he attributed the leaks to some spy within his inner circle of advisors. Yet for something so vital as Wacht am Rhein, he could take no chances. He forbade transmission by telephone, telegraph, or wireless of any information that could in any way be connected with the offensive, including the supposedly deceptive codename he himself had coined. Anything dealing specifically and identifiably with the offensive had to be transmitted by Officer Courier, the Gestapo on his tail, and all else had to be justified by another codename, Abwehrschlacht im Westen, which was already in use for the fighting around Aachen. To justify to foe and uninitiated friend alike the massing of men and supplies, the German command pointed to the imminent American offensive to be launched from positions near Aachen toward the Rhine and the industrial region of the Ruhr. The first paragraph of almost every movement order contained the words "in preparation for the anticipated enemy offensive." When the 6th Panzer Army, for example, had completed its organization and its SS Panzer divisions were refitted and prepared to move west of the Rhine, an entry in the war diary of von Rundstedt's headquarters read, "There can be no doubt that the enemy will commit maximum strength and maximum material to force the breakthrough to the Rhine. Our own defensive measures must be attuned to this. Hence, the Commander-in-Chief West will order the transfer of 6th Panzer Army to the OB West Theatre on 7 November. Then the 6th Panzer Army moved, not into the Eifel, whence it was to launch its attack, but onto the open plain near Cologne, at which the Americans were to aim their November offensive, and there the Germans intentionally bungled their security, parading their preparations before the eager eyes of Allied intelligence. Not until 3 days before the offensive was to begin would the 6th Panzer Army make the move of some 35 miles into the Eifel, and then only at night. For the 5th Panzer Army, which had seen its first commitment in control of a few panzer brigades in a futile counterattack in September against the 3rd US Army's south flank in Lorraine, there was the problem of disengaging from the front in Lorraine and moving north for some apparent purpose not associated with the offensive. Since such a move could hardly escape Allied notice, von Manteuffel's headquarters appeared in late October in the line near Aachen, where it assumed command of 2 corps already committed. The Americans were obviously going to employ armour in their coming offensive. It was wholly logical for the Germans to oppose them with a headquarters schooled in the use of armour. The shift of the 5th Panzer Army served an added purpose in that it halved the sector then held by General Brandenberger's 7th Army, which to that point had been responsible for both the Aachen sector and the Eifel. Von Manteuffel's entry into the line left Brandenberger responsible only for the Eifel, a reality to which Allied intelligence was long accustomed. Who might suspect that the 7th Army had a new mission? As the target date for the German offensive approached, it became essential to pull von Manteuffel and his headquarters back from the line in preparation. To mislead the enemy, the headquarters of the 15th Army, which had been responsible for the sector opposite the British in the Netherlands, secretly relieved the headquarters of the 5th Panzer Army and assumed an alias, Gruppe von Manteuffel, in the process getting into a proper position for mounting an attack in support of Wacht am Rhein. In the Netherlands, the headquarters of the 25th Army, which took over from the 15th Army, called itself the 15th Army, while a bogus headquarters calling itself the 25th Army pretended through false wireless traffic to be assembling west of the Rhine near the assembly area of the 6th Panzer Army. When pulled from the line, von Manteuffel and his headquarters hide behind the innocuous name of Feldjägerkommando Z. There was less complexity in relieving Field Marshal Model and his Army Group B of some of their responsibilities, for any intelligence officer would recognize that in commanding a front extending from the North Sea across the Netherlands into Germany, and thence south almost to the Moselle River, more than 150 airline miles Army Group B was overextended. Without unusual provisions for secrecy, a new headquarters Army Group H assumed control of the front in the Netherlands, leaving Model responsible only for the Aachen sector and, most importantly, the Ardennes Eifel. As those shifts took place, Field Marshal von Rundstedt's problem was to halt the American attacks, or at least to contain them sufficiently so that they would not jeopardize the German offensive. There was some space to be traded for time in the south, where on November 8th, the 3rd US Army began to attack from the vicinity of Metz, aimed at gaining the German frontier and penetrating the west wall in the Saar-Palatinate, that corner of Germany lying in the angle between the Moselle and the Rhine. Nor was there particular concern about the 1st French and 7th US Armies that had driven up from southern France, for even should those armies get through the forbidding Vosges mountains, the broad moat of the Rhine would bar the way. The critical sector was in the north. There von Rundstedt gained some respite in that once the Allied attempt to jump the canals and rivers of the Netherlands with airborne troops failed, the British commander, Field Marshal Sir Bernard L. Montgomery, had to turn his attention to clearing the seaward approaches to Antwerp. Failing to clear the 60-mile approach to Antwerp from the sea when the port fell without a fight in early September had been one of the more serious tactical lapses of the campaign, and Hitler's order to build a strong defence along the banks of the Schelde estuary a most prescient reaction. As the Allied attack began in mid-October, The Germans opened dikes that industrious Dutchmen through the years had erected to keep out an antagonistic North Sea, and it took the Allied soldiers, mostly Canadians, almost a month to battle through mud, muck and flood before the last German soldier fell back from the banks of the Schelde. Even then, minesweepers required 3 weeks to cleanse the channel, so that not until November 28, 3 months after the British took Antwerp, was the first supply ship to drop anchor in the port. Around Aachen, von Rundstedt had neither leeway nor respite. As the 1st and 9th US armies began their offensive there on November 16th, the jump-off line was in some places no more than 6 miles from the Little Roer River, the only obstacle remaining before the open plain comprising the last 25 miles to Cologne and the Rhine. To be sure, the American command had aided von Rundstedt during October and early November by attacking with inadequate strength to clear a vast stretch of woodland south and southeast of Aachen, an extension of the forests of the Ardennes and the Eifel, known as the Hurtgen Forest. As the Americans attacked, they ignored the fact that on the upper reaches of the Roer River, the forest concealed 2 big dams, the Schwammenauel and the Urftelsperre. Should the Germans blow the dams, they could produce a single destructive floodwave in downstream lowlands where the Roer marks the start of the Cologne plain, or by calculatedly releasing the waters slowly, a flood that might last for 2 weeks or more to prevent crossings of the Roer or trap any force that had jumped the river. Those dams thus were of critical importance to von Rundstedt, for even should his defence falter in front of the Roer, he could still gain at least 2 weeks on behalf of Hitler's offensive by manipulating the waters of the river. Conversely, and unknown to von Rundstedt, the American command was belatedly to become aware of the importance of the dams. Just 3 days before the German offensive began, the First Army was to mount an attack to seize them, an event that was to have an effect on Hitler's offensive far out of proportion to the number of American troops involved. In the end, the German defence held. It was a remarkable achievement, accomplished as part of a resurgence that some Germans, in remembrance of World War I Miracle of the Marne, referred to as the Miracle of the West. Lashed by Hitler's ambition and regimented by the rigorous discipline of the police state Nazi Germany and its army during the fall of 1944, demonstrated a resilience not unlike that of the giant Antaeus in Greek mythology, who regained his strength whenever he touched Mother Earth. During the last half of 1944, the German army refitted the skeletons of 35 divisions that had been stripped of flesh on either the eastern or western front and built 15 new divisions. With a salaam to the German people, Hitler traded on national pride by calling them Volksgrenadier divisions, an honorific previously reserved for infantry divisions that had performed with extraordinary ability and valour. In selecting that name, Hitler drew an unanticipated intelligence bonus. Only recently, he had issued a public decree calling for a levy of the rank and file of the German people to flock to the defence of the fatherland. He called that force the Volkssturm, and both the Supreme Allied Commander, General Eisenhower, and the commander of the 12th Army Group, Lieutenant General Omar N. Bradley, who was responsible for the Ardennes, confused the two, seriously underestimating the capabilities of what they termed the new Volkssturm divisions. Some of the new and refitted divisions had to be returned to the Eastern Front, and some helped hold the line in the west, but others joined the 4 SS Panzer divisions as part of the Führer's strategic reserve. Without Hitler's knowledge, von Rundstedt used a few of the divisions to relieve others temporarily, so that they might be pulled from the line for quick rehabilitation before the offensive, but few of them stayed in the line for long. With Hitler's approval, some of the newly formed general support artillery and rocket units were employed at some length, in the process eating into ammunition reserves stockpiled for the Ardennes, but at the same time gaining battle experience. So, 10 to 20,000 men who might have helped fill the strategic reserve had to fight as individual replacements in the defensive battles. Yet in the end, of 28 divisions specifically designated for the offensive, only an SS Panzer division, a Volksgrenadier division, and 2 Panzer divisions were never able to get out of the line for the refitting necessary for participating in the offensive. The process of getting the others ready plus 2 reinforced brigades nevertheless pushed forward Hitler's target date another 5 days, to December 15th. That the soldiers making up the new and refitted divisions bore little resemblance to the well-trained, thoroughly indoctrinated, splendidly equipped troops that had swept out of the Ardennes in 1940 was obvious to all. It was only with moderate hyperbole that General Dietrich, who had a reputation for grousing, complained of divisions filled mainly with kids and sick old men. But even though under the new decrees 16 and 17-year-olds were liable for service, few below the age of 17 were actually assigned to army combat units, although there were many under that age and even younger who served as volunteers or quasi-volunteers in the SS divisions. So even though men through age 60 were theoretically liable for service, few of anywhere near that age were actually called, and seldom did a man over 45 find himself in a combat unit. The principal weakness of the troops was a lack of training for those men only recently called up, and for the thousands upon thousands hastily transferred from the Navy, the Luftwaffe, and rear echelon assignments. Yet the numbers, at least a total of more than 250,000 for the first wave, were impressive, and there was still a residue of considerable size of combat veterans and hard-nosed non-commissioned officers to infuse flint into the new and refitted formations. In equipment, the most serious shortage was motor transport. Even the best-equipped divisions had no more than 80% of the vehicles called for under their tables of equipment, and one Panzer Grenadier division had 60 different types of motor vehicle. Providing spare parts for such a fleet would have been a nightmare, but there were few spare parts for vehicles in any case. Another Panzer division, the Panzer Lehr, had only enough half-tracks to transport one of its Panzer Grenadier battalions. The others had to use trucks or bicycles. On the other hand, the amount of artillery the army managed to amass was impressive. There were 9 of the new artillery units known as Volksartillerie Corps, each equipped with 50 to 100 pieces, and 7 of the new rocket or Volkswerfer brigades, each with more than 100 rocket projectors, and both types of units were fully motorized. The difficulty with those and other corps and army artillery units was that the guns were of varying caliber and even manufacture. There were, for example, more than a smattering of French and Russian pieces. That complicated ammunition supply. The total of all general support artillery and rockets was 1,900 pieces, a powerful array, and that was in addition to artillery organic to the divisions. Much of the divisional artillery was horse-drawn, but the German soldier had long been accustomed to that. While the Eastern Front and other parts of the Western Front starved through the fall for want of armoured vehicles, Hitler allotted to Army Group B and the Strategic Reserve 2168 tanks and assault guns. Most of the assault guns were a lightly armoured, self-propelled, high-velocity 75 mm piece, which was an effective anti-tank weapon, as well as a superb weapon for supporting infantry in the attack. Since some 700 tanks and assault guns had to be held, at least for a time, with the 15th Army for the projected attack in support of Wacht am Rhein, that left approximately 970 for the opening wave of the offensive, and around 450 for the follow-up force. Hitler's beloved SS Panzer divisions had priority on those. The total numbers available fell short of the 2,500 that had participated in the Blitzkrieg through the Ardennes in 1940, but it was a powerful force nevertheless. As expected, it was in tactical aircraft that the Germans were weakest. Despite Hitler's early prediction of at least 1,500 fighter bombers, the commander of the Luftwaffe, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, could promise only 1,000, and was actually able to deliver only a few more than that, and those in driblets, except on one spectacular occasion. That figure bore no comparison with the 2,000 available in 1940. Those forces were all that Hitler could muster for an offensive in the 6th winter of the war. Given the condition of the Third Reich by that time, and the vast superiority in men, weapons and equipment of its enemies, to assemble even that much while still fighting on 2 fronts was an exceptional achievement. That the numbers were no fewer was attributable in large measure to the defensive stand of a presumably defeated German soldier who had regained his strength upon touching Mother Earth, and to the performance of his leaders, the old soldier Gerd von Rundstedt and the Lion of Defense Walter Model. Transporting the attack divisions to their assembly areas and accumulating and transporting the ammunition rations and fuel that they would need in the opening days of the offensive was another remarkable achievement. By Hitler's order, the assignment went to General Jodel's chief, the head of the OKW Field Marshal Keitel. Under a head of state less unorthodox than Adolf Hitler, an officer in Keitel's post would have been in the forefront of the strategic and tactical planning for the offensive. But Hitler himself had all but usurped that role, and Keitel was not a man to press his prerogatives with his Führer. Yet the head of the OKW was an efficient administrator, and he brought to the logistical assembly for the Ardennes that not unworthy talent. The workhorse of the build-up was the Reichsbahn. By 1944, the state railroad system was so thoroughly tied in with the Wehrmacht that it was in essence an adjunct of the military. Ever since the swift and massive concentration for the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, which had astounded the world, the German General Staff had looked to the railroads as the basic instrument for strategic concentration, which explained the creation of spur lines into the Eifel before the Great War. In preparation for the Ardennes offensive, engineers reinforced the pillars and supports of all the rail bridges over the Rhine, lest some lucky hit by an Allied bomb should send an entire bridge crashing into the water. A lucky hit it probably would have been, for Allied airmen considered bridges of any kind to be one of the most difficult of targets. Ringed with multiple batteries of flak guns, the bridges over the Rhine were doubly inaccessible, and throughout the fall of 1944, as official priority focused on other targets, Allied airmen made no concentrated effort to take out the Rhine bridges. For the trains themselves and the marshalling yards there was no such immunity. Yet darkness and rain or a sky heavily overcast were all elements basic to Hitler's entire plan. Each train carried its own anti-aircraft guns, which tended to keep the Jabos, as the Germans called Allied fighter bombers, at high and usually ineffective altitudes, and the cabs of locomotives had long been plated with armour to cut down on casualties from strafing among engine crews. For the final run across the Rhine into the Eifel, engineers timed their movement for an overnight trip, and if anything untoward intervened, there were a number of tunnels in which to hide until bad weather or nightfall came again. Labourers were so organised for quick repairs at the marshalling yards that seldom, even after a heavy air attack, did bomb damage interfere with operations for longer than 48 hours. The fact that through much of the fall, Allied airmen made German oil production rather than transportation their number one target also helped the railroads. The campaign against oil had its effect, although not nearly to the extent that Allied analysts perceived. By stringent rationing, by drawing on stockpiles and by taking extraordinary measures to bring oil from Hungary, Keitel managed to meet the anticipated requirement of not quite 5 million gallons, but about half of that would still be on the east bank of the Rhine as the offensive began. There was no intent to rely on captured Allied stocks of gasoline. Any such stocks would be a bonus for sufficient supplies were on hand. Yet that was not to say that there would be no problems in getting fuel forward to the troops who needed it. In trying to keep the offensive secret, moving the German fighter aircraft westward, however few in numbers, posed a special problem. Any careful observer of the air scene during the early weeks of autumn could have discerned that the Luftwaffe had virtually abandoned close air support for the Western Front in order to concentrate its available aircraft for defence of the industrial centres. Since Allied air attacks against the homeland continued without let-up, any move of fighter aircraft back to the west would appear to be odd. In the event, Reichsmarshal Göring failed in his attempt at secrecy, but how the Allied command reacted to the failure was another matter. Toward the end of the first week of December, corps commanders who were to be involved in the offensive were at last let in on Hitler's secret, and on the 10th, the division commanders. Late the next afternoon, von Rundstedt, Model von Manteuffel, and approximately half the corps and division commanders gathered at von Rundstedt's headquarters in Ziegenberg Castle. Ordered to divest themselves of their sidearms and briefcases, they boarded a bus, which began a circuitous tour in darkness and rain through the countryside, lasting half an hour, and ending finally at the Adlerhorst, actually a 3-minute ride from Ziegenberg Castle. Dismounting, the generals passed between a double row of armed SS guards, standing rigidly to attention, and descended into a deep underground conference room. As they sat down around a large square table, an SS guard assumed a position behind each chair, glowering with a ferocity that made at least one of the generals, Fritz Bayerlein, fear even to reach for his handkerchief. Entering with Keitel and Jodl, Hitler took a seat at a long, narrow table at one end of the room. He was von Manteuffel, noted a broken man, with an unhealthy colour, a caved-in appearance. His hands trembled, and to von Manteuffel, who had seen him less than a fortnight earlier, he appeared to have aged even in that short time. His body seemed still more decrepit, and he was a man grown old, completely overworked and tired. Yet when Hitler began to speak, his appearance changed. A kind of fire came into his eyes, and as his speech gathered momentum, he grew ever more forceful. For more than 2 hours, he harangued his audience, speaking extemporaneously of German history, German destiny, the glories of Frederick the Great, the absolute necessity for Lebensraum for the great German people, the virtues of what he called the preventive war he had begun in 1939, the necessity for a nation to display not only toughness, stubbornness and endurance, but also daring to make it clear to the enemy that whatever he would do, he will never be able to count on a capitulation. Never, never, never. People had doubted him over Austria, over Czechoslovakia, over France, but he had triumphed, and he would triumph again. It was then that he began his tirade about the strange bedfellows the war had aligned against Germany, ultra-capitalist states on one side, ultra-Marxist states on the other. A great victory would bring down this artificial coalition with a crash. The next day, as Hitler briefed his second set of generals, he granted his commanders a minor concession, a 24-hour postponement for last-minute preparations at the front. Nulltag, the jump-off date, was set for Saturday, December 16. There was to be no further postponement. The naming of a final target date set in motion a plan previously worked out in meticulous detail for a 3-day movement to forward assembly areas, a plan based in large measure on the secrecy achieved in preparation for a number of German offensives in World War I and for the concentration in 1940. Although the troops were to be told nothing of what they were about to do until the night before the jump-off, the Volksdeutsch had already been combed from the combat units, lest they go over to the enemy with some small but revealing knowledge of what was to come. Troops marched only by night, taking cover by day in forests and cooking only with charcoal fires. Special security detachments prowled in search of anybody who violated camouflage discipline. Patrolling on the existing front line was restricted to the most trusted soldiers, lest somebody who had observed more than he should might desert. There was to be no increase in artillery fires above the norm. Those troops not already in the line, a few of the Volksgrenadier divisions, had already relieved units not scheduled for the offensive, were allowed to advance at first no closer than 12 miles toward the front, then to move progressively forward over the last 2 nights, first to a line 6 miles from the front, then 2. In concern for the noise created by tanks and in recognition of their mobility, the restraining line for panzer units was farther to the rear. On the last 2 nights, as tanks and artillery pressed closer to the front, troops covered the roads with straw to muffle the sound, and planes flew low over American positions in hope of concealing or at least disguising the noise. To 18-year-old Pvdt Helmut Stiegeler, the snow and the cold reminded him that Christmas was only a short time away. Our thoughts wandered to our folks back home. No one talked to the other, and silently we marched along, unaware of what was ahead of us. The next night, the night before the jump-off, Stiegeler and other men of the 12th Volksgrenadier Division's Engineer Battalion at last learned what they were to do. After an evening meal of sweet rice with plums, each group was given a bottle of booze, and off we went. Meanwhile, for all the efforts at secrecy, there had been yet another lapse in security at the governmental level, when on November 15th, the Japanese ambassador Baron Oshima was invited to confer with Foreign Minister von Ribbentrop at Sonnenberg, 60 miles east of Berlin. During the conversation, Oshima asked about the offensive in the west that Hitler had told him would be launched sometime after the beginning of November. Had there been any change in that intention? Although von Ribbentrop was evasive about details and timing, he confirmed that Hitler still intended to take the offensive in the west. Then again, it might be the east. There were some suggested Baron Oshima, who believed that the big German offensive in 1918 had hastened Germany's defeat, that without it, the war might have ended differently. Would it not be a wise plan for Germany to fight a war of attrition? Absolutely not, rejoined von Ribbentrop. The Chancellor believes that we cannot win this war by defence alone, and has reiterated his intention of taking the offensive right to the bitter end. In reporting that conversation to Tokyo, Baron Oshima sneered at the possibility of a German offensive. It was, he said, one of the instances in which truth from the mouth of a liar reaches the highest pinnacle of deceptiveness. But a few days later, he changed his view. Thinking back to his earlier conversation with Hitler, he notified Tokyo that he believed we may take at face value the intent of the German leadership to mount an offensive, for a Germany whose battle lines have contracted virtually to the old territory of Germany will have no choice but to open a road of blood in one direction or another, and probably, he added, in the West. As always, those two messages from Oshima to his government were soon on the desks of intelligence officers in the Pentagon. He who defends everything, Frederick the Great used to admonish his generals, defends nothing. During the fall of 1944, the Supreme Allied Commander, General Eisenhower, had 65 infantry airborne and armoured divisions with which to cover a front extending from the North Sea to Switzerland, a distance not counting local twistings and turnings of over 500 miles. Had he divided the front equally among his divisions, each would have been responsible for just over 7 miles, which would have constituted a fairly cohesive linear defence. Yet what if the enemy should penetrate the line? Where was the reserve to eliminate the penetration? Besides, nobody won wars by defence alone. The problem was how to gain sufficient strength for an attack. Eisenhower's solution was to concentrate his forces within 2 sectors where the terrain was most conducive to advance. One concentration south of the Ardennes, pointed toward the Saar industrial region, the second and larger, north of the Ardennes, pointed toward the Ruhr. To make those concentrations possible, he employed only minimal forces to defend the other sectors, particularly in Alsace and the Ardennes. Even so, Eisenhower was unable to hold out a reserve. As the alignment developed, the British 21st Army Group, with the 1st Canadian and 2nd British Armies under Field Marshal Montgomery, was in the far north, mainly in the Netherlands. To the far south, the 6th Army Group, commanded by Lieutenant General Jacob L. Devers, had the 7th US and 1st French Armies, mainly in Alsace. The American 12th Army Group, under General Bradley, was in the centre, the 9th Army north of Aachen, the 1st Army around and south of Aachen, and the 3rd Army in Lorraine. While the 1st Army's greatest concentration was in the vicinity of Aachen, its commander, Lieutenant General Courtney H. Hodges, was also responsible for the Ardennes. The assignment fell in turn primarily to the E8th Corps, which had to cover a front extending from the Losheim Gap in the north to a point southeast of Luxembourg City in the south, a distance of about 60 miles. Since the E8th Corps had only 3 infantry divisions, that meant a defensive frontage for each division of about 20 miles, more than double the length of front normally assigned a division to defend. In the northern reaches of the Ardennes, from the Losheim Gap to the vicinity of Monschau, the southernmost division of the 5th Corps held a front of similar length, so that only 4 divisions were responsible for the entire 80-mile front through the Ardennes. The Allied deployment reflected what became known as Eisenhower's broad front strategy, which was actually nothing more than a version of an age-old, time-tested practice of advancing in parallel columns. Yet to Eisenhower's chief British subordinate, Field Marshal Montgomery, it was anathema. In late summer and through the autumn, Montgomery insisted that the Allied command possessed neither the strength nor the logistical resources to support 2 major drives into Germany. He wanted the entire front to go on the defensive, except in the sector north of the Ardennes, where he wanted to concentrate sufficient strength and sufficient logistical support to launch and sustain a juggernaut all the way to Berlin. It was a proposal not without reason or merit, but Montgomery, who was inclined to argue his proposals in imperious tones, weakened it by insisting that the entire attacking force, to be composed of British Canadians and Americans, be under his command. Indeed, that he be designated as overall ground commander for the entire Western Front. To American generals, the proposal appeared to reek of personal ambition, an attempt to usurp a portion of Eisenhower's prerogative as supreme commander, a position that had gone to an American for the basic reason that the United States would be furnishing the preponderance of forces. Yet there were other reasons why Eisenhower turned Montgomery down. There was no way, his logistical planners told him after detailed study, that the existing resources could be reallocated to make it possible to sustain an offensive all the way to Berlin. The basic problem was the lack of ports close to the front, a problem to which Montgomery himself had contributed by failing to clear the banks of the Schelde estuary once Antwerp fell with its port facilities intact. There was also a possibility that the German armies were less nearly finished than seemed apparent from the overwhelming defeat inflicted on them in France, that they might muster reserves to deal telling blows to any thrust whose flanks would be exposed for several hundred miles. Eisenhower himself had seen, at a place in North Africa called Kasserine Pass, the damage supposedly defeated German forces could wreak. It was a serious difference of opinion, one replete with rancour. German agents may well have passed some word of it to Berlin, thereby contributing to Hitler's belief that a grand offensive in the West stood a chance of splitting the Anglo-American alliance. Yet for all the rancour, the fact was that it was nothing more than a difference of opinion between a commander and a subordinate, albeit the two senior field commanders of the two principal powers in the Allied coalition. But those were two powers that had achieved a degree of cooperation and coordination never before known in coalition warfare. Although serious differences of opinion and such human failings as national chauvinism and personal antagonism well might recur under the impact of severe adversity at the front, would even the spectacle of the two senior commanders coming to blows be sufficient to wreck such a close-knit coalition? The exchanges between Eisenhower and Montgomery over strategy and command occurred at a time of heady optimism, an optimism reflected in intelligence reports at every level. In late August, for example, the G2 at Eisenhower's Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, Major and General Kenneth W.D. Strong, had written 2.5 months of bitter fighting, culminating for the Germans in a bloodbath big enough even for their extravagant tastes, have brought the end of the war in Europe within sight, almost within reach. It was a view the Supreme Commander himself fully shared. The defeat of the German armies is complete, he noted a few days later in the course of dictating an office memorandum, and the only thing now needed is speed. At headquarters of the 1st U.S. Army, the G2 Colonel Benjamin A. Dixon saw political upheaval within Germany, or insurrection within the Wehrmacht, as likely to hasten the end of the war. The commander of the First Army, General Hodge, had sent General Bradley a bronze bust of Hitler taken from a house in the Belgian border town of Eupen, and told the commander of the 12th Army Group that given ample ammunition and an additional division, the First Army would deliver the original in 30 days. However much Hodges jested, the incident reflected the prevailing state of mind. Only one among the G2S in the senior commands sounded a note of caution. At headquarters of the 3rd U.S. Army, Colonel Oscar W. Koch remarked that for all the debacle that had befallen the enemy, his withdrawal, though continuing, has not been a rout or mass collapse. All indications pointed to the fact that the Germans were determined to wage a last-ditch struggle in the field at all costs. The enemy, he noted, was playing for time, and weather and terrain would soon be on his side. Yet Koch's was a lone voice, and despite the stiffening of resistance in the lowlands of the Netherlands at Aachen, in the Hurtgen forest, and in the rolling hills of Lorraine, the optimism was slow to dissipate. Meeting in Washington in October, the Allied body charged with directing the conduct of the war, the combined chiefs of staff made up of the service chiefs of both Britain and the United States, still saw hope of an early victory. They wanted Eisenhower to institute extraordinary measures to assure victory before the year 1944 came to an end. Shift the strategic air offensive from all but the most immediately remunerative targets, employ all troops and stockpiles of supplies, without regard for withholding reserves, and make use of a heretofore super-secret proximity fuse that exploded an artillery shell by radio impulse in the air just short of the target, thereby sharply increasing the lethal fragmentation effect of the burst. Eisenhower himself at that point urged caution. The approaches to Antwerp still had to be cleared, he told the U.S. Army's Chief of Staff, General George C. Marshall, and the port facilities of Antwerp were essential to the final battle. Eisenhower nevertheless saw the possibility of taking the Ruhr before the end of the year, or at least of gaining a bridgehead over the Rhine. Those were the goals of the American offensive that opened near Aachen on November 16th. But after almost a month of fighting, and a cost to two American armies of 125,000 casualties, the American troops were gazing not at the fabled Rhine, but at an obscure flood-threatened Ruhr only 6 miles beyond the line from which they had started. Furthermore, they were powerless to cross the little river until somebody got around to doing something about the dams upstream. The fact that German troops who in September had appeared thoroughly beaten had fought back with such determination and relative success, the Allied commanders attributed to German stubbornness, to blind faith in the Führer, to devotion to the home soil, and most of all, to the solid generalship of Gerd von Rundstedt. There were other contributing factors: abominable weather-constricted terrain, the West Wall, some few continuing logistical problems on the Allied side. Yet nobody saw in the stalwart German stand any grand design that might threaten the survival of the Allied armies. Indeed, Allied intelligence officers perceived the heavy fighting as contributing to the possibility of a sudden German collapse. Even before the November offensive began, Eisenhower's G2, General Strong, noted that the Germans were losing the equivalent of a division every few days and were being forced to shift meagre reserves hither and yon as one threat subsided and another arose. The dwindling fire brigade, wrote Strong, is switched with increasing rapidity and increasing wear and tear from one fire to another. When the Germans failed to react with a strong counterattack against the American offensive that opened near Aachen on November 16th, the First Army's G2, Colonel Dixon considered that they had lost any opportunity for a decisive blow and saw the possibility of large-scale surrenders leading to the collapse of the German state. As late as December 12th, only 4 days before the Germans were destined to emerge from the mists and snows of the Eifel into the Ardennes, the report of the 12th Army Group's G2, Brig General Edwin L. Seibert, noted, "It is now certain that attrition is steadily sapping the strength of German forces on the Western Front, and that the crust of defences is thinner, more brittle and more vulnerable than it appears on G2 maps or to troops in the line." At about the same time, Field Marshal Montgomery's G2, a Don from Oxford University, Brig E.T. Williams, was declaring, "The enemy is in a bad way. His situation is such that he cannot stage a major offensive operation." Gentlemen, Secretary of State Henry L. Stimson reputedly stated in 1929, when abolishing a small State Department-funded cryptanalysis branch known as the Black Chamber, "Do not read one another's mail." Yet the remark failed to deter the Signal Intelligence Section of the Army's Signal Corps and the Navy's Office of Naval Intelligence from trying to read the mail of potential enemies, particularly that of the Japanese, which led to the remarkable achievement of magic. On the other hand, that attention to one aspect of the dirty work of spying failed to carry over into the field of battlefield intelligence. In the United States Army, seldom did an officer consciously pursue a career in battlefield intelligence. The 12th Army Group's G2, General Seibert, for example, got into intelligence simply because somebody flagged his file after he served a tour of duty as military attaché in Brazil and the First Army's G2. Colonel Dixon was a reserve officer who, when called to active duty in 1940, drew an assignment in intelligence only because he was proficient in French and German. Seldom did G2S move on to high command. Those gems went to chiefs of staff and to plans and operations officers. The G3S. The G2 and his counterpart at regimental and battalion level held one rank below that of the G3 or S3, and before war came, they often drew lowly extra duties such as club officer or command historian. In the British Army, by contrast, intelligence was a prestigious field. Eisenhower's G2, General Strong, for example, planned a role in intelligence from his days as a cadet at the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, where he became fluent in French, German and Italian. Following a pre-war tour as an assistant military attaché in Berlin, he headed the German section of the War Office, then served successively as Chief of Intelligence of the Home Forces and of Allied Force Headquarters in the Mediterranean. That was not to say that American intelligence officers were incapable. As with any group of staff officers, their abilities varied, but almost to a man they encountered the antipathy of other members of their staffs, arising from the long-established low estate of the intelligence officer. For Colonel Dixon at the First Army's headquarters, the situation was compounded by a personality conflict with a strong-willed Chief of Staff, Major and General William B. Keane, who many said virtually ran the First Army, as well as between himself and the G3 section. Benjamin Abbott Dixon got his nickname from childhood playmates in Washington, D.C., who dubbed him Monkey. His older brother shortened it to Monk, calling him that when the two were at West Point, and it stuck. He was a handsome man, over 6 feet 3 inches tall, angular moustached, and at 37 years of age, he maintained the same weight at which he had played on the football team at the military academy. In the classroom, Dixon displayed a photographic memory, a talent that was to serve him well in the profession he eventually entered. He graduated from West Point in one of the accelerated classes during World War I and served in the American Expeditionary Force in Siberia. But after assessing the chances of promotion in the post-war army as poor, he resigned, earned a degree in mechanical engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and went into the warehouse business in Philadelphia. Having maintained a reserve commission, he returned to active duty as a captain in 1940, and soon rose to become a Corps G3 in North Africa, where he gained a reputation as a pessimist, which stuck with him even though events at Kasserine Pass proved his point. He also gained the confidence of his commander, General Bradley, who took him along to England when forming the staff of the First Army. But when Bradley, after the invasion of Normandy, moved up to command the 12th Army Group, a ready-made staff was waiting so that Dixon, Keane and the others were left behind. Going beyond the usual resentment of one headquarters for the next senior headquarters, the First Army's staff officers saw their counterparts at the 12th Army Group as Johnny-come-latelys, lacking their own battlefield experience, and some on occasion played on their past association with General Bradley to bypass his staff and deal directly with the general. None resented his counterpart at the 12th Army Group, more than did Dixon, for Edwin Seibert was a career artilleryman who had never served in intelligence, until to his surprise he was plucked from an artillery command with an infantry division in the United States to become G2 at headquarters of the European Theatre, which was essentially an administrative and logistical headquarters. On the basis of experience in North Africa and Normandy, Dixon viewed Seibert's job and his rank as rightfully his. Although Dixon later denied that he held any animosity for Seibert, his contemporaries saw it otherwise. One remarked that he hated Seibert, and the latter reciprocated. Whether for that reason or for some other, coordination between the G2 sections of the 1st Army and the 12th Army Group was minimal. Except when specifically asked, Dixon never visited headquarters of the 12th Army Group, and when he wanted to consult a G2 at a higher level, he went to Brigadier Williams at headquarters of the 21st Army Group. Under the American staff system, there was no chain of command among intelligence staffs. Dixon served his commander, Seibert his, and even though Dixon served at a subordinate level, Seibert had neither command nor technical jurisdiction over him. To Monk Dixon's associates in intelligence at higher levels, he was a volatile man, a pessimist, an alarmist. It was sufficient, for example, whenever Dixon learned that the Russians had lost contact with a division on the Eastern Front, for him to list it in the enemy's order of battle in the West. At times, he might have several divisions listed in the West that other intelligence officers knew to be elsewhere. They called them Monk's shrubbery. Although the practice caused no real harm, it contributed to the view of Dixon as an alarmist, a man who sometimes had to be sat on. At an operational level, Army Group and below prisoners of war constituted a basic source of intelligence. American intelligence officers considered themselves particularly adept at gleaning information from German prisoners, for they might employ as interrogators refugee German Jews whose appearance belied their race, but whose knowledge of Germany enabled them to gain a prisoner's confidence and ask penetrating questions. Thus, the intelligence officers saw no reason to question what they learned from prisoners during much of the fall of 1944. And since most of those who surrendered were dregs, their morale low, the interrogations tended to reinforce the view that Germany would be unable for long to continue the fight. So, did the capture of prisoners from such special units as so-called stomach battalions, composed of men with digestive problems who required a special diet, did not the very existence of those units indicate that the Third Reich was running out of manpower? In France and Belgium, civilians had also been a basic source of intelligence, but with the crossing of the German border, information from civilians had virtually ceased to exist. It was much the same story with special agents from the Washington-based Office of Strategic Services who had found it relatively easy to penetrate the lines in France, but who had little success inside Germany. Furthermore, relations between the First Army's headquarters and the OSS were strained. In Normandy, Colonel Dixon had found the OSS agents to be individualistic. their demands on the Army's communications too heavy, and he had convinced General Hodges to kick them out, with the exception of a small section under Captain Stuyvesant Wainwright that engaged in counter-espionage and anti-subversion. In the office of the OSS detachment at headquarters of the 12th Army Group, some wag placed under a picture of Hitler the caption, "He fools some of the people some of the time, but he fools Dixon all of the time." The strain increased when somebody at the 1st Army's headquarters wrote a parody of a prisoner of war report, allegedly representing an interrogation of Hitler's latrine orderly. Finding it amusing, Captain Wainwright sent it to his OSS superiors at the 12th Army Group, where everybody missed the point and took the parody seriously. An order was soon on the way to the 1st Army to fly the prisoner back to Schaeff for further questioning, much to the subsequent embarrassment of the OSS. In the long run, it probably made little difference that the 1st Army had only one small section of OSS operatives, for those located at headquarters of the 12th Army Group had every license to operate in the 1st Army's sector and beyond it into enemy territory. Yet not a single OSS agent penetrated the line and entered the Eifel before the enemy's offensive began. Another basic source of battlefield intelligence was aerial reconnaissance, including that conducted by artillery observation aircraft. Despite many days of inclement weather in the month preceding the German offensive, seldom were all reconnaissance aircraft grounded. During that month of November, the 67th Tactical Reconnaissance Group of the 9th Tactical Air Command, which supported the 1st Army, flew 361 missions, of which 2/3 were considered successful. Yet seldom were missions flown over the region that was to prove critical, the Eifel, for the basic concern was the sector in the north between the Roer River and the Rhine. Although there were many requests for reconnaissance over the Eifel, air officers assigned them low priority, and when weather was marginal, pilots usually elected to fly over the presumably more important region to the north. In the critical last 5 days before the German attack, pilots of the 67th Tactical Reconnaissance Group flew only 3 missions over the Eifel, all 3 on December 14th over Trier.